I want to introduce Ken Paxton, who is, of course, the Attorney General of Texas. Attorneys General, Ken, you weren't here this morning, have come up multiple times today, and there has been a recognition of the incredible role that attorneys general have played in reawakening antitrust in the US after 20 years of pretty dormant lack of activity. In fact, if you can only indulge me in a moment of perhaps selfishness, can you put up the slide, the next one that we have? Because I think this, for me, no, the slide, the actual slide, the picture. Right. So that is a moment that I remember very fondly. You will notice a woman in white at the back. Who might that be? But this is the day when, on the 9th of September 2019, Ken, who is there just behind the General of Utah, I believe, you had just spoken and you were basically announcing to the press the bipartisan initiative on Google. And that was, for me, sort of a particular fun time. I learned a lot of things, including that you guys talk to each other as generals. I mean, this is mind-blowing to a European. General Paxton. So there you go. But we can take that down now. More seriously, I wanted you to have an opportunity. I have a particular affinity personally for Texas, and I'm very fond of the state, but also the work that you do, which has been unique. I mean, you have taken the lead in this bipartisan effort on ad tech, which is the most complicated part of the anti-Google wars. I remember you making a very touching speech in Denver when that effort started on Armistice Day for Europe in 2019. And so will you give us a sense for the motivation, the progress, where you think you are? We don't care about the legal aspects, but the sort of the broader vision.
Sure. Well, first of all, if you weren't from Europe, you would be from Texas, I can tell. And I want to thank you.
I'd be honored.
That's a compliment.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you for putting this on, because this is one of the most important issues of our time, dealing with these big tech companies. I know that in America, at the beginning of our country, the framers were really worried about big banks and them becoming too big and controlling financially our country. And this is, to me, no different. This is the big banking issue of what our founders were dealing with. And so when you have people like Ken Buck who are willing to take on companies like Google, I mean, that is a significant undertaking, because you know you're going against a company that makes $770 million a day. They make more money than most countries. They have more resources than most countries in the world. And so I have a lot of respect for what you're doing, because I know that there's a lot of risk and not a lot of upside for you personally to do that, but it's certainly the right thing to do. But I got interested in this because in my first 4 years as Attorney General, this was not on my radar, other than I got more complaints about what was going on with certain companies, and I won't mince words either, Google, but there were some other companies we were looking at as well, and I didn't understand the issues. And so I literally spent 2 years after I got reelected, this was my goal, was to find out and try to understand the marketplace, what was going on. And so I put a team together. We went out to Silicon Valley. We talked to professors. We talked to technology experts. We talked to people that were involved in Microsoft litigation. And over time, it made sense to us. This ad tech case came together. And I think a lot of people didn't understand it. It was very complicated. It was complicated for us because we're not technology people. We're lawyers. And to try to put that together was a very complicated and challenging situation, because we'd never done it before. And she's right. States had kind of stopped litigating antitrust, so there wasn't a lot of expertise that we could go to internally to deal with this issue. But it became very clear to me that there were so many complaints about what was going on with Google and how many people were being put out of business. And as we understood some of the things that Ken was just talking about, which was that they were controlling over 90% of the ad market, that they were representing both the buyers and sellers, which we wouldn't put up with in real estate, we don't put up with it on the stock exchange, and that they were making exorbitant fees. which in the end is a disadvantage for consumers. So my passion is that we are all paying more. Our consumers are all paying more than they should. And somehow, if we don't stop this type of behavior soon, they will become even more powerful and more unstoppable. So we're at a really specific crossroads right now. We have to stop them. We have to change the structure, or we will never stop them.
And just to follow up on that, your legal complaint, which is progressing slowly through the courts, and there is a chance now that it comes back to Texas, but without the legal detail, what are you seeking to achieve? Is it structural relief? Where are you going with this?
So, I mean, I started this not with the goal of getting money for Texas, although I think there are damages due to the state of Texas and to all consumers who have had to pay for this and who have their information taken without permission and used and sold without their permission. We actually have 4 lawsuits against Google. This isn't the only lawsuit we have. The Antitrust is one, and it was the first. But in the end, I didn't do this just to get money. I wanted to change the structure because I feel like it is a threat to our democracy. It is the very threat that, as I said, our founders were worried about, that these corporations were going to dictate our entire democracy, affect our elections, affect really all of our buying decisions, affect all aspects of our lives, and we, the constituent, the consumer, would lose control of that. So I'm not in this for anything other than structural change. Otherwise, we're going to lose our democracies.
And there is been, of course, following the State Attorney General's effort, the federal agencies have come behind you effectively with similar complaints. How close is that work and coordination? You've led the way, I think very clearly, but there is also federal work behind you, right?
Yeah. So when we started off, our case was the most unusual. There was a search case that both a whole group of states filed, the DOJ filed. I wanted to keep our ad tech case separate, and it seemed like most people didn't understand it. The fact that those search cases are still going, we're a part of some of those as well. But the fact that the Department of Justice then filed their case recently, that is very similar to our case, tells you that people have figured it out. This is a really good case. It is legitimate, and it has legs. And look, I'm happy that the Department of Justice is involved in this, because the more angles we come at this with, the better off we are. That's why I hope that Europeans get involved in this. We need to work together, and the more angles, when you're dealing with a company this powerful with this much money, it helps to have more resources, so they can't just target Texas. They have to deal with the whole landscape.
So Europeans are involved in this, and they're doing some work there.
One of the things that I think is really important, and I meant to say this earlier, if it was just money, they can continue to they can charge higher rates. It's like a little tax, right? So charging them $5 billion or $10 billion is really just a tax, and they can live with that and continue to dominate and actually generate more ways to pay that tax. And really effectively, we're paying that tax as consumers. And so I think it's really important. We can charge them whatever we want. It's really important that we have structural change, or they'll beat us at this all the way down the line.
I just wanted to add one thing about the marketplace, Ken, that I think this may be headed. These companies, Google in particular, should be paying us to use our advertising to be able to sell our advertising. And it should be our choice to make that decision. And by stealing that without our control, they get away with information. But if we had a marketplace, you would see Bing and Google and others competing with dollars, euros, for our business in that way. And I think that's what your ad tech case will ultimately do, is lead to that type of marketplace.
Yeah, and where in the world can you, in any other environment, like you couldn't have a realtor representing both the buyer and the seller and getting commissions and negotiating with themselves to figure out, that's what Google's doing. They're representing people who are buying ads and people who are selling ads at the same time. And who wins from that? Only Google wins from that.
So I want to move on to the European side, because of course what you're doing is enforcement. Europe has started earlier with enforcement and then embarked in a an extraordinary democratic project, I think, of attempting to regulate as well as enforce. So Stephanie Joncorten is one of the main architects of the regulatory effort in the European Parliament. She was very much in the Econ Committee that drove the legislation, the DMA, DSA, through at record speed. And we find ourselves now in Europe with legislation which is actually enforced. I mean, we're talking in a moment with those who are actually at the cold face enforcing it. But Stephanie, tell us a bit about the thinking and where do you think this is going. Do you think it has the prospect to achieve what you thought it could achieve?
Yes and no. Well, thanks, Christina, for organizing this very impressive conference on the antitrust, very hot topics without caffeine. I think thanks to Christina, we don't need caffeine. So, well, with this room full of experts, I'm not going to explain in detail the DSA and DMA, but anyway, that we passed at the European level. But however, I cannot prevent myself from saying a few words, as these two texts are really landmark legislations for the regulation of the online environment. So why addressing these two texts, DSA, DMA, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, together? I mean, the topic is quite broad, as you've just mentioned. At the same time, the answer is quite straightforward. On the one hand, we do need to regulate big techs, giant for their unfair practices that fail to be properly addressed under existing EU competition law. That's a real failure. And on the other hand, we have to ensure a safe, transparent, and trustworthy environment for consumers and discourage traders who abuse platforms from selling unsafe or counterfeit goods. These are, you know, the two, let's say, the two sides of the same coin. Now, with the DSA and DMA, the EU is setting its own rules of the game. And with the DMA, EU is now saying to the big tech what they can do, what they cannot do, and not the other way around. And for years, we experience big tech deciding on who can enter the market or not, what choices consumers could have, or imposing their own rules, their own terms and conditions, and with no room for negotiation whatsoever. So breaking news today, it's over, or at least on the paper, because we will need to hear the enforcers speaking now. But at least we've got a very nice paper on that. With the DSA, we are also now saying to Twitter, to Facebook, to open up their algorithm, and we oblige them to have the necessary means to ensure online moderation that will lead to a safer online environment. And you know, while Elon Musk is now buying Twitter and wants to return to unlimited free speech and firing moderators at the same time, he has to know that he will not be able to do that in the European Union. And we'll have to respect our rules. Otherwise, he will have to do without a market of more than 560 million consumers. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Big techs are now looking for fresh money to cope with the increased need for online moderation, and we have to be careful that, you know, with what they are doing now, they do not create new solutions, you know, with the Twitter Blue or the Meta Verified, these new tools that could create, again, their own new standards, new ecosystems, and their proper rules at the same time. So finally, the results are at stake are very high. We are talking about, you know, tons of companies that had and still have to shut down their business because of years of unfair practices from big tech. We're also talking of millions of consumers who are still injured by unsafe products online. But also citizens who are victims of disinformation or harmful content online. This is exactly the purpose of our role as co-legislators, as in the European Parliament to say stop. And I have to say that the legislators, and as I said, with all this legislation we have on paper are great, not only because I contributed to it, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If we want to walk, the implementation leg is crucial. Now we've got one leg, the adoption. And talking concretely about implementation, let's be honest. Turning now to the Commission. For all the bold measures, obligations and interdictions that we are now imposing to big tech, such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and all the gatekeepers, the European Commission will have a bunch of less than 100 of people working on it. Less than 100 people. Compared to the army of lawyers that all big techs have. We are working to assist to a remake, the new version of David versus Goliath, with new characters, being the European Commission on the one side and versus big tech on the other. Goliath was an enemy warrior. He was fierce, like people in Texas, I think, and bigger than anyone else. David was a young shepherd, refusing the king's offer of the royal armor. He kills Goliath with his sling. Let's hope the same destiny to our 80 warriors at the European Commission, but don't get too excited. It will only begin in 2024. So we are still in the teaser moment. Thanks, Christina, for making it cheesy. But don't get me wrong, if you don't want to, and we don't want to get rid of big tech, they brought still a lot of benefits to consumers, innovation, and so on. And I just think we need to ensure the famous Brussels level playing field, you know, to make sure that companies compete on the merits and not on unfair practices. To me, that is the essence of competition we all share. This is why it's so important that antitrust must continue to work in parallel. And the question of this articulation is key. And I'm still waiting to see how it will interplay, and there might be some overlaps when it comes to DMA, also DSA, which is a horizontal regulation. But how will it work with influencers, with the fight against online child pornography? Many challenges lie ahead of us, but definitely the EU is paving the way to other jurisdictions. This is breaking news as well, you know. As the US, we know China, South Korea are working on it. So we now have to deliver, no choice, with concrete results for citizens and company. In a few years, let's say 3-4 years ago, we started from scratch. It was the Far West, as Thierry Breton called it. To now, plenty of text that regulate the digital environment. DSA, DMA, Data Act, Data Governance Act, Artificial Intelligence Act. It would be quite a challenge to ensure a great interplay. And maybe now it's a big call for desilization of the work at the European Commission. Big challenge. Europe is, of course, a global trendsetter. Let's say a worldwide best influencer, and I think it would be and do great in TikTok. Also, maybe not anymore, as EU officials, and now the European Parliament is the same, are forbidden to use it. So better do some Instagram Reels now. As we did with the regulation on the protection of personal data, Europe is, I think, creating standards, really, that will definitely serve as examples to the whole world. We do it today on digital, but also on environmental, social. We are, I think, an example for many countries in the world, and let's just take the artificial intelligence. The digital revolution has triggered the global tech race, and the EU is currently falling behind, with only 8 of the world's top 200 digital companies located in the Union. If the EU fails to set standards for human-centered artificial intelligence based on our ethical based on our democratic values, they will be decided elsewhere. Besides all our work on the others, we also have to work on ourselves. It's not only about regulating or unbundling big tech. We also have to give us the means to achieve all the global objectives, such as the strategic autonomy and the resilience of our internal market. So ex-ante regulation, finally, is just one piece of the European strategic cake. Our regulatory, I think, framework must be clear and predictable. It's not only about funding, but it's about creating the right opportunities. It's clear that we missed a lot. We missed the wave of personal data. We could make the most of industrial and open data, I think. ChatGPT should have been European. And I think we should better see the potential in using public procurement to increase resilience. Smart procurement already helps to achieve the key priorities related to the twin transition, green and digital, innovation and social objectives across many industrial ecosystems, and by, I think, creating demand and supporting strategic sectors, public procurement definitely helps to reduce dependencies and strengthen the resilience of industrial ecosystems. So it's time for the EU to become truly aware of the need to ensure a fair share of European public purchases, which is made for innovative European companies. And to conclude, Christina, to conclude, because I see
you can see my killer looks. Yes.
To conclude, well, the EU has not rested on its laurels, as you can see, for the past years. It has achieved a lot in terms of digital regulation and competition, DSA, DMA, new foreign subsidy tool, upcoming new relevant market definitions, and so on. Let's now ensure that expertise, resources, experience with both the Commission and national competition authorities and national authorities will be enough to deal with all of it. Most of all, well, let's not forget why we have all these tools, and don't be shy to pursue some objectives. And for the competition purist, I used to be one as a lawyer, but please shut your ears, as I'm going to say something very difficult for you to hear. That industrial policy and competition policy can go and must go hand in hand if we want to succeed in the future, while still sticking to our values and principles of our fair market economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So I want to now move on to the implementation. Indeed, you've talked about lots of things, but of course, the introduction of the DMA, DSA, and the legislative framework has been a major achievement in Europe, done in record times. Now we are in the stage where we are implementing it, bringing it into life. And I realize I have more than a fair share of Italians on these panels. This isn't planned, but it is true. So we have the pleasure of having Filomena Chirico and Alberto Bacchiega. Only I can say these names properly, huh? No one else could. Who are both at the Commission involved in the implementation effort. Filomena comes from the Breton cabinet, so has that kind of executive perspective. Alberto leads the team implementing at the coal phase. So I would like you to give us a sense, whichever way you want to split it between you, for the challenges and the effort that you are facing.
Thanks, Christine. I'll give it a first go. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. I feel honored and humbled to be in this this amazing conference, in this very distinguished panel, of course, in particular. As you mentioned, I've been in the past 3 years advising Commissioner Breton on, in particular, platforms regulations, or the digital services and digital markets regulations. And I've been witnessing, it's been a fantastic experience of witnessing an amazing democratic process. A democratic process of convergence in the vision of what we wanted to achieve on both sides, from the societal perspective, if we can put it like that, and the economic and the market access perspective. There has been convergence across the whole political spectrum and across Europe, the different countries, on what we wanted to achieve. And it was, I don't know, some speaker before me spoke about the Brussels consensus. I don't know if the Brussels consensus, I would summarize, reflects what the previous speaker would say, but it was about achieving a new framework which would guarantee fairness, contestability, as we know, innovation, but also accountability. You mentioned accountability before, free speech. Some of the speakers before me mentioned free speech, and safety for everybody on the internet. So this process led to now a framework which is quite unique and innovative in the way it's been realized. So with the help of course, mainly by the Parliament, I would say we only advised or supported the negotiation process after the proposal. And again, something which was raised before, an ex-ante regulation is now badly needed. A few speakers before me said, we have achieved an ex-ante regulation, an horizontal framework that has created a centralized Europe-wide system of enforcement with the European Commission at the center, with a network of national authorities covering the different aspects, so both for the DSA and for the DMA, the competition aspects, data protection aspects. So it's true we have allotted 80 people for the Commission, but we have all of these plus 150 for the DSA, by the way, and we have all sort of this network of authorities across Europe that is helping us in the David versus Goliath fight, as Madame Joncourten put it. And we are building also a network with experts beyond this, the regulatory area, because we have also experts in algorithmic transparency, contacts, and building also a working relationship with the authorities composed of engineers. We know that there are some in Germany, some in France, and we are working with them already. So it's a complex organization for the same, not complex, I would say comprehensive organization for a common objective. And this framework has become so attractive that actually there are already initiatives in the Parliament, or discussed with the Council, of course, to complement it, to integrate it, to enrich it. And we mentioned AI, but also the Data Act, the digital identity, political advertising, the forthcoming, actually, defense of democracy, to connect also to the other side of the debate. Now, all of this is all based on important considerations and very good ideas. I think one point of attention for us at this stage is that all of this complements the framework we have put in place, but does not weaken it because of possible inconsistencies or legal uncertainties. So this is the challenge that we see at the moment, to make sure, more than the silos, for us it's more the consistency and legal certainty that are needed to make it have teeth, as you were mentioning as well. Another thing that actually I wanted to raise, but it was raised by everyone before me actually, this is by no means a European, all that we are addressing with the DSA and DMA are by no means a European only problem, or issues or difficulties or things that we need to solve. And we know, I studied, I think it was more than 20 bills in Congress that had been presented covering one or the other, in American Congress, of course, covering one or the other aspects. There are, of course, initiatives in Britain, initiatives in Australia. We are discussing with Japan. Now, we have it in place in Europe, so we know that we might be aligned with most of our partners in the objectives, but now we are putting it in place. So it's it's also a big responsibility for us because we know that everybody's watching if it's working, if what we are doing, and what impact it's going to have. And that's where it links for me to my new head of part of the enforcement team. When we finished with the negotiations, we adopted the new proposal, then the commissioner came to me and said, well, now we have the powers, we have to make it happen. So that's when I joined Alberto and Rita's team in the commission to help contributing to making the promise of the DSA and the DMA a reality. Now I'm particularly working on the DMA, so more specifically, so the DSA, my other baby, has been now in good hands of my colleagues in the Commission. So as enforcer, the first thing I did when I arrived, I asked ChatGPT to write an opera on the DMA. So that was my first action. So the opera was about the European Commission, big tech, and European people, and at the end, the European Commission and the European people managed to rein in big tech. That's a true story. I'm not making it up today. I did that, and that was the answer ChatGPT gave me. The second thing after that we are doing, and then again to the point of the team that we are building, the team was already up and running when I joined. We have people with legal expertise, colleagues with economic expertise, technical, data protection experts, data scientists, and we are building this up even more. So we are getting even more colleagues with this type of expertise. Also colleagues with antitrust enforcement experience and regulatory supervisory experience. So we have the mix of skills that we think will help us in achieving the impact we are looking for. So to achieve it, then we are already working. As I said, Madame Yoncourtin said this is a teaser and this will be happening in 2024. For us, it's already happening. We are already discussing solutions, concrete solutions. You know that we are doing workshops as well on specific obligations and elements of the DMA. We are discussing not only with the potential gatekeepers, but with the potential beneficiaries of the DMA, with associations, with experts. So there is a lot going on at the moment. And the purpose is that we get to 2024 with the impact of the DMA, not just the entry into, not just that it starts applying, it's just happening. And the benefits are being felt and are being realized already then. How we are getting there, I would say, that's my last point. That's also part of the experience of this first month in the enforcement, in the enforcer team. This is a new form of regulatory supervision. Many of us come from the antitrust experience. Many of the companies come from past antitrust or competition enforcement experience. But this is a different animal. We have said it, we repeat it all the time. This is not competition, this is not antitrust. But also this is not an adversarial process. This is a dialogue, a regulatory dialogue in the wording of also the DMA, which will lead us to, will bring us to March 2024 with the system in place that respects the obligations that have been harmonized in the legislation. And here I would borrow a metaphor that Ariel has used in the past. We are not in the business of looking for a culprit, looking for a victim, a motive, and a weapon to prove that a crime has been committed. We are in the business of identifying risky entities, supervising them, and making sure that if in fact ultimately they break the rules, then they will be punished. But for me it's a bit, you said we have more than a fair share of Italians, and that's my Italian side. I'm a football fan. So I see it as when some football fans are subject to, they are identified as risky on the basis of some objective criteria, and they are put under regulatory supervision in the sense that they are not accused of anything, but they have to report to the police, they cannot own a weapon, they cannot go to specific, particularly difficult matches or exciting matches. So this is the way we see what we are doing. So we have the DMA squad, which is supervising the risky football funds and making sure that everybody has fair and equal access to football stadiums for all the matches in fairness. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I love the metaphor. So Alberto, you next. You are very much, as I said, at the coal face, talking to companies and making it happen. Tell us about that.
Perhaps I'd like to start from the question that animates this panel. Will antitrust or regulation get there first? Actually, I was thinking either we get there together or we don't get there at all. I think we have a very steep mountain to climb, and to climb a steep mountain you need two sturdy boots, and only one doesn't take you very far. And I think that's the choice that motivated the European legislator. And so my job is in the implementation of the DMA. So what the DMA wants to do? Well, it's written in the law. It wants to ensure fairness and contestability. But if I could add other three things we really would like to do with the DMA is also to ensure predictability, transparency, and also speed. And how do we do that? What does the Act allow us to do? But first of all, predictability. The DMA is constructed as a clear, confined list of services, of platforms that are covered by the DMA, and of criteria to identify companies that whose platforms are covered by the law. So, and it also ensures the speed because we have now a very clear checkpoint. This September, we will have to say who are the first batch of gatekeepers and for what platform services. It's not the end of the game because the DMA also allows for market investigation to identify further services. So it's not going to be the end of it, but certainly for us, we know after summer, we will start being judged on the results of of our work. Second checkpoint we will have is next spring. Then, for the platform services identified in September, compliance will kick in 6 months after. It takes us to spring 2024. Again, there, as Filomena said, we will be judged for the very concrete impact the DMA will have. And if it's not an impact that business users, companies feel, but also consumers feel, I think we will have failed. So again, in a year's time, I think we will be very much on the spot to show that something has happened. Again, it's not in one shot, because compliance is not just a one-off, but it's the regulatory dialogue Filomena mentioned. So bear with us as well if next spring not everything is perfect, is the beginning of a story. And that is extremely important for us to have all stakeholders involved, whether business users or consumers, both in the phase where gatekeepers will have to provide their view and their vision on how they're going to comply, but also when they actually comply, to make sure that compliance is effective, is not just on paper. And they will have, at regular intervals, every year, they will have to tell us and the public how they are complying. So there is a massive role for everyone to ensure that compliance works. And then I wanted to say briefly two things that the DMA is not doing. And the first, the DMA is not there to reverse history. Of course, the situation we have now in terms of landscape and market power is the product of at least 2 decades of history. It's not for the DMA to undo that. If anything, this is the role of antitrust, and we just heard how active agencies are, including the European Commission, in order to tackle this. The DMA is more forward-looking. What the DMA wants to do is to ensure that fairness and contestability will be from now on. And how we will check that? What will be judged on? and that is more longer term and more difficult, but to me a very important point is that we should arrive at a situation where when there is an innovative, possibly disruptive innovation, this innovation can actually compete on the market and is not only bound to succeed if it is homogenized within the ecosystem of one of the incumbents. Because my fear is that the situation today is very much like that. Of course, we have continuous innovation, but the question is this innovation able to threaten the status quo, or is this innovation accepted only if it is compatible or if it is made compatible with the status quo? And I think here Ariel has written about this, so I'm very much borrowing his concepts on this. And the last point, the last thing that the DMA I don't think is meant to do is to explore new forms of anti-competitive behavior. The DMA, again, is by construction restricted to closed lists. And if we have to innovate, if there are innovations on the market, if there are things we couldn't see, that is not, at least in the first moment, is not the role of the DMA to tackle. Is the role of antitrust. And what is the fourth checkpoint for us, I think, is to make sure that this interaction between antitrust and DMA will continue to work in the future. So with a lot of the provisions in the DMA build on our antitrust experience. What we need to do for the future is that we need building antitrust experience. We need using antitrust to explore new instances, new cases, new platforms possibly. And actually the DMA has the tools within it to adapt itself. But the experience cannot be done within the DMA, can be transmitted to the DMA through updating the obligations if necessary, and as this is a regulatory instrument, actually to think in the DMA not as a one-for-all legislation, but as all regulation, as legislation that regularly needs to be evaluated and updated and modernized.
So let me put two devil's advocate points, which are, on the one hand, we have enormous admiration for what's been achieved and support for what you're doing. So this is not in question. One can also take a step back and say, we're getting there quite late. The market power of these gatekeepers is grotesque. It's very difficult to somehow back away from that. And you are going to be trying to deal with some manifestation, the most egregious manifestations of that power, but you're not going to disperse the market power. You're not going to affect market structures in any way, shape, or form. So what are the chances that this might work in a world where some, and I'm not pointing a particular one, but there is a very strong sense that for these American companies, unless something happens on the Hill, it doesn't happen at all. So we'll manage Brussels, but the real threat is over there, and we'll just keep the Europeans happy, but you know, the real focus is avoiding Ken putting a further bill forward and getting approval.
I mean, that is the risk, but the DMA is not made to undo the past. It's simply not its role. But I think the good news is that the DMA not only is complementary to antitrust enforcement, is complementary to merger control, and I think is also complementary very much to legislative initiatives in the US and in other legislations. I think we just need to be conscious of what we want to achieve, of what we can achieve with the DMA, to understand how far we can go with the DMA and how far we can go with other instruments.
Filomena, do you want to add anything?
Maybe an anecdote, actually. In the workshop of last Monday on the interoperability provision of the DMA, there was a debate that just sprang amongst the audience. As you know, in those, or probably for those who don't know, in those workshops, the Commission is taking a step back. We are not taking any position or commenting on anything, so we are listening to the audience to get concrete ideas for solutions for how to make the DMA happen. And one of the most active discussions that emerged and debates was about how, actually whether and how the DMA interoperability provision will benefit outside the EU. So there is an expectation that actually the companies might do the opposite, so actually do what they are obliged by now to do in Europe, also elsewhere, so that also consumers and businesses that are not necessarily resident or established in the EU might benefit. So it was an interesting point, because it actually raised quite some spirits and hectic discussions.
That's fascinating, and I think a perfect point, a perfect jumping off point for Corey. Corey is one of my favorite people, a celebrated journalist and bloggist and author and commentator and book writer. And I'd like you to just take us through, in your usual energetic way, a vision as to what do you think is happening over here? What can be achieved?
So I have a formal question for you first, which is I'd prepared 2 sets of remarks.
Yeah, put it together.
You want me to merge them together? Very good. So I want to quibble with Marco just a little. Marco described the janky era of Mosaic 1.0, and I want to say that that was the great era of the web. I remember that as this incredible kind of efflorescence of pluralism and diversity. And you know, I'm a man in his 50s with 2 artificial hips, and so it is my role to be cranky here. But I think that an internet made of 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4 is objectively worse than the web that we used to have. I think things did get worse. And I have a theory about how they got worse, and I have a theory about what we can do with it. So I think it's endemic to digital platform economics. And I think in digital platform economics, you have this familiar pattern, irrespective of which platform we're talking about. The platform operator first allocates a bunch of surplus to users. Those users come and they get locked in by some mechanism. Once they're locked in, that surplus is withdrawn in whole or in part and allocated to business customers. Those might be performers, those might be creators, they might be advertisers, they might be publishers, they might be platform sellers. They become locked in as well. And when they get locked in, and once the hook has been set both in the platform users and in the business customers, then the surplus is withdrawn from both of them and allocated to the shareholders of the firm. And this is a process I call enshittification. And that's how you make antitrust interesting. You put a swear word in your discussions of antitrust, and it races around.
I asked you to talk about that.
Thank you. I would have said the word anyway.
Yeah, I know you would.
So I had a couple of case studies. I boiled it down to one. I want to talk about Facebook because it's kind of the case study of this. So first, Facebook was very good to its users. If you remember, and Dina Srinivasan's written masterfully about this, when Facebook first opened up to the general public, its pitch was, bring your social media to us, leave behind MySpace. We are the privacy-forward alternative, and we'll never sell your data. And they didn't at first, right? Instead, what you got was a feed full of all the things you'd asked for. Everyone you cared about in the world, everything that they had to say, you saw as soon as they said it. And it was quite a good time to be on Facebook. If you remember Facebook as something quite good and you think you were a rube for liking it, it wasn't. It used to be better. And once those users were locked in, they were locked in by the collective action problem of just all being there, right? The network effects have this kind of intrinsic high switching cost because all the network benefits are a network benefit that you surrender when you leave. And so once they were all holding each other hostage, Facebook started to allocate their surplus to business customers. So advertisers, obviously, they started to spy on those users so that they could allocate the surplus to advertisers, whom, once again, they gave a very good deal to. Any of you who advertised on Facebook in the golden age of Facebook will remember excellent targeting, low prices, every ad you paid for was seen by someone, and you developed a big sales funnel. If you were a media company back then, all you had to do was post a tiny little excerpt and a link back to your website, and Facebook would non-consensually cram it into the eyeballs of users who never asked to see it. And it was a giant funnel of traffic for your website where you ran your ads and got the lion's share of the money. Right? So you've got media companies that got locked in. They hire people to do Facebook strategy. You got advertisers who are locked in. And eventually, once that surplus is entirely there, Facebook withdraws it and allocates that surplus to its own shareholders. So today, advertisers famously get a very raw deal. We all know about Jedi Blue, thanks to the Texas case. It's just one of the many frauds that Facebook has perpetrated on advertisers. Media companies also get a very bad deal from Facebook. If you're a media company and you post a little excerpt and a link, it'll never be shown. If you're a media company and you post the whole text and no link, it probably still won't be shown to the people who subscribe to it, who ask to see it, unless you pay to boost your stuff to the people who ask to see it. And of course, there are other forms of fraud that Facebook has used that is this kind of surplus reallocation. The pivot to video is a very noteworthy example of this, right? They defrauded a bunch of media companies, telling them that we all really liked watching video on Facebook. Media companies raised billions in the capital markets or acquired it through debt instruments, and then all went bankrupt because Facebook was lying. And that's another way of allocating surplus. Facebook wanted to see if they could compete with YouTube. It turned out they couldn't. They got someone else to pay for it. Now, in shittification, its end goal is to produce this circumstance in which all of the surplus necessary, or that's not necessary to keeping platform users locked in, is allocated to shareholders. So there's just enough left in so that you don't leave. And this is a very brittle equilibrium, right? It's very easy to be knocked out of equilibrium just by like a single scandal, privacy scandal, a whistleblower, a really bad platform abuse that makes headlines all around the world, live stream mass killings, whatever it is, all of a sudden people are like, it seemed like a good idea. It doesn't seem like such a good deal anymore. I can totally imagine myself leaving. And they go. And this is how we ended up with Facebook where it is today, where their pitch to us is that we are all destined to live out the rest of our lives as legless, sexless, heavily surveilled, low-resolution cartoon characters, and media companies are going to pay to build it. Now, this equilibrium is very brittle, and when it falls out of equilibrium, platforms collapse, and that is okay. The focus of intermediary regulation should be protecting the platform users when the platform collapses. It should not be trying to improve the platform so as to prolong their crepuscular senescence as they get worse and worse. And there are two ways to do this, right? The first one is something that's been around since those early days of browsers, in fact, before the early days of browsers, something called the end-to-end principle. The idea that if you have a willing sender and a willing recipient, the role of the intermediary is to deliver those packets as efficiently as possible. So how will we work that out? Well, if I subscribe to your feed, I should see what you post. If I search for your goods, they should be the top result. If I hoist an email out of my spam folder and say it's not spam, anything else you send me should never be marked as spam. It is baffling to me that we had an actual congressional debate about whether unsolicited political fundraising emails should be marked as spam when we missed the extremely low-hanging fruit of whether things that a constituent asked to hear from their political representatives should be marked as spam. Surely if there's a speech interest in spam and political email, that's the most important one we have. So beyond end-to-end, we can also enshrine a right of exit. Now you may have heard about a server called mastodon.lol. They had 12,000 users, and there was a fight that broke out over this new Harry Potter game. And the administrator decided to shut down his server. He said, you're all going to have to find somewhere else to go. You've been so obnoxious on the server I've been providing for free. Hit the road. And now, this may sound terrible to you, but Mastodon has this incredible feature that is sui generis to this new generation of federated services, which is that with one click, you can export everyone you follow and who follows you. And with one more click on any other Mastodon server, you can re-import it and be back up 2 clicks later and running again. So the 12,000 users of this server, it sounds like they got a raw deal, but they got a better deal than the 450 million users of Twitter who, if they want to leave Twitter, have to shatter their social networks to go somewhere else. A right of exit rule could just build on our existing data portability rules, which already require platform operators to hand data to their users on demand. We could just add to that the obligation, for example, if you want to shut down your little community Mastodon server, that for a year you have to retain the data in case a user demands it so that they can set up somewhere else. And unlike other intermediary regulations that we keep passing, like lawful but awful speech rules or copyright filter mandates, this is a rule that doesn't pose a capital moat to new market entrants. This guy with his 12,000 users that he was hosting for $10 a month could comply with that rule. It doesn't require that we only have giants who can comply with giant-side regulation. Not only that, but it's eminently administratable. How do you find out whether this guy is complying with the rule? You ask the user, did you get your data? And if the user says no, you make them give them their data. This doesn't require intensive fact-finding, doesn't require that you drag Facebook's engineers in and ask them whether Facebook was cheating on this abstract rule or that. It's a bright-line rule that's very easy to administer. In other words, we can treat bad platform owners as damage and route around them. Now, enshittification is not just rent-seeking, it's not just wage theft, it's not just fraud. It is endemic to digital platforms, it's a digital phenomenon. Now, it shares a root with other competition problems, right? 40 years of antitrust malpractice, tolerance for anti-competitive mergers, tolerance for anti-competitive conduct like predatory pricing, but it has these sui generis characteristics that arise out of its digital nature. So on the one hand, platforms are able to do this stuff I call twiddling. They can reach in and change the platform dynamics from minute to minute and second to second. And if you're playing a shell game, the quickness of the hand deceives the eye. The faster you can move, the harder it is for the mark to figure out what you're doing. So Cantor talked about platforms being able to set the rules of the road. It's not just that they get to set the rules of the road, they get to constantly change the rules of the road from minute to minute and second to second. Every platform scandal we've ever had involves high-speed digital maneuvers that just wouldn't be possible in the analog world. If you're a grocer and you want to raise the price of eggs to price gouge your customers, you need an army of teenagers with pricing guns to fan it across the grocery store and sticker over the old prices. If you're Amazon Fresh and you want to price gouge on eggs, you drag a slider and the price of eggs changes. So John D. Rockefeller, JP Morgan, they would have done this stuff if they could. But if you're a rail baron hoping to destroy a ferry business that you're competing with, you don't click a mouse and lay some rail line. Amazon can drag a slider and lose $200 million a month discounting diapers and put diapers.com out of business. And platforms are not run by evil sorcerers who hacked our dopamine loops. They're run by ordinary mediocrities who have the same repertoire of tricks as their predecessors. They just use computers to do it faster. This is why platform criminology is such a frustrating exercise. As soon as you figure out what's going on, it's changed. Now, twiddling isn't all bad. Users twiddle too. Ad blockers, the largest boycott in consumer history. Removing DRM, jailbreaking a device, installing an alternative app store, all of this represents user twiddling. Jan said that large corporate investment is a minatory effect on new market entrants. That's only true if you're not allowed to reverse engineer and make interoperable products. But if you're allowed to jailbreak iPhones, the fact that Apple has sunk umpty billion dollars into putting an iPhone into everyone's pocket is an incredible enticement, because you can free ride on that investment, jailbreak those phones, make your own app store, offer 10% commissions to their 10% best sellers, and scoop up all of their profit. Right? The more investment your opponents make in a digital world, the better it is, provided you're allowed to twiddle back. Twiddling is how we claw back value from platform operators. When publishers are header bidding, they're twiddling back. And the issue isn't merely that platforms twiddle with every hour that God sends. It's that they hoard the twiddling. Right? Under rules like anti-circumvention, patent, copyright, tortious interference theories, cybersecurity laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the United States, twiddling back has become a crime. It's become felony contempt of business model. So to get the internet back, the good internet, we need to de-inshitify it. And if the three causes of enshitification are one, traditional antitrust problems, two, too much twiddling on the platform side, and three, no twiddling for us, the remedies are obvious. We do antitrust, like we're talking about. We do breakups. We do ex-ante regulation. We do merger scrutiny. Maybe we give a 3-year capital gains holiday to any firm that unwinds an economically significant merger of the last 20 years and bring all the corporate raiders of the 1980s out of retirement for one last job. And then we need to throw the enshitification flywheel into reverse. We need to slow it down. We need to block platform-side twiddling, right? We need to say, well, you've got privacy laws now. You've got to stand up mandatory APIs. You've got minimum wages for gig workers. All of these things, keep your fingers off the knobs, right? We take away their twiddling knobs, and then we give twiddling back to users. We restore adversarial interoperability, the right to reverse engineer, to use bots, to make new products that affect the way that the platform works within the confines of things like data protection laws. So rather than asking Facebook whether a reverse engineered app is a good app or a bad app, we ask our elected lawmakers whether it violates our laws as human beings and citizens. A world where platforms are no longer constrained by competition nor by regulation, where they can add as many knobs as they want to their backend and twiddle them all day long, and where we are prohibited from twiddling those knobs, that is a world where we are inevitably going to get twiddled to death. Thank you.
Okay, some final wise words from Ariel, who I would like you to go back to the beginning of this discussion. We talked about content moderation. You've written about toxicity on the internet. How do we save the internet in the age of Musk?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Christina, for having me. And what I'll try to do is to supplement the excellent discussion that we already had, because in many ways, I think a lot of the comments that we heard are about what we can do to save the internet. So maybe my first comment, I'll make 5 comments. My first one would be that probably we just have to remember that we must be realistic. I think we're doing a lot. The DMA, the DSA, changes to antitrust. But we just have to remember that we cannot fix everything. And what I mean by that is that while we're in a better position to deal with market power, with abuse, with manipulation, misleading information, all these elements, there is a limit to regulation. So a lot of things that create harm can still create them online, even if we are extremely successful in what we do. From algorithmic bias, data used to teach the AI, black box. So we just have to remember that what we're trying to do is probably remove the toxins from the system, but it will be very hard for us to go to the ideal that we had, all of us had many years back, about how the system should be, how inclusive it should be. Which leads me to the second challenge that links us to democracy and society. The trajectory that we have will be very difficult to change. I think what we're doing is we're bringing it closer to where we want it to see, but we are still heading in a certain trajectory that does undermine some of the foundations of our society. And I say that just to, in a way, keep it real, that even if we're successful, there has to be a much wider attempt from politicians to strengthen society, to strengthen discussion, human autonomy, decision-making, deal with excessive choice, with a lot of things that, even though they are mentioned in legislation, we cannot really address them completely. Now, in terms of things that we should focus on, we spoke a lot about concentration, and I think it's clear to everyone that we have a very significant crisis when it comes to level of concentration in digital markets. I think plurality is the key, not just when it comes to markets, but also when it comes to what happens on those platforms, what happens within the ecosystem. So things that we don't always look at from a competition perspective. Because what you have in digital is this amplification that turns any lack of plurality into a real power that can have a massive impact. And we heard some comments about Twitter. So once the bird was freed and Musk took over Twitter, of course we had an increase in certain types of communications. And there was an empirical research that was published a couple of weeks ago about super spreaders on Twitter. And one of the conclusions of that was that super spreaders that actually managed to increase engagement, for 4 out of 5 of them, this was the result of Elon Musk with his 128 million followers, Elon Musk replying to them. So what you have is a completely different engine. So this is something that completely changes the dynamic online. We have a situation whereby we have islands or pockets of power that really affect the public discussion, very easily change the minds of people. And this is not something that we often look at when we think about markets. It's something more internal about the plurality within the ecosystems. My third comment is about aiming ahead of the duck. And what I mean by that is that apparently when you hunt, and I never hunted, but apparently if you hunt for ducks, what you need to do is never aim at the duck, because obviously the duck flies, and if you aim at the duck, nothing happens. So what you do is you calculate the trajectory and you aim ahead of the duck. And I think when we think about what we need to do, we truly need to aim ahead of the duck. And especially if you're thinking about digital giants and big tech barons, They're not like ducks. They are aware of you aiming at them, so they take evasive maneuvers. So aiming ahead of the duck is what I think we're doing with ex-ante regulation. It is our attempt to maybe somehow bypass the problem that we have of high-tech moving 3 times faster than the industry, and enforcers moving 3 times slower than the industry, and courts even 3 times slower than that. And this creates a very difficult gap in our ability to deal with that. But what it also means when you have to aim ahead of the duck is that when we have regulation, we shouldn't focus on the symptoms. And as much as the DMA is really welcome, the DMA in many ways is looking at past behavior, past problems that we had, and tries to codify them so we can deal with them. But as technology advances in supersonic speed, certain things that we worry about now will be achieved using completely different methods in the very near future. So think of regulation that deals with cookies. Who cares about cookies today? You know, we all understand that if you have a regulation that focuses on that, the technology changes. So we need to retain that flexibility. And indeed, the DMA has such flexibility. But we have to really, I think, be aware of the need to constantly appreciate what are the value chains that are at stake, what are the profit motives, what is actually driving the technology, and therefore try to address that. And as we think forward, I want to say a few words about innovation. I think there wasn't a panel today where innovation wasn't mentioned, and that's great. But sometimes I have a feeling that we all speak about innovation, but very much like the weather, we don't do that much about it. So innovation is mentioned all the time, and we all worry about it, but it is immensely difficult to embed these considerations in antitrust analysis, as we all know, because of the difficulty to predict what is going to happen. But I also think that we need to change maybe the language in which we approach innovation. The first thing that I would say is that if we really want to save the future, we need to shift away from our quantitative viewpoint when it comes to innovation. Not every time someone is investing millions in innovation, this actually generates consumer welfare. And what I mean here is that what we see once we attribute value to the type of innovation is that we also see toxic innovation. And I know that theoretically you should say that all innovation is positive, but I'm talking about the implementation of the innovation. And Maurice and I, in our recent book, what we focus on is on the link that you see between increased market power and increased toxicity of innovation. So when you look at patents, and when you look at investment in innovation, what you see is that as the competitive pressure is weakening, companies invest in innovation, but innovation that is geared to extract value or destroy value. So a lot of the innovation that we have is about identifying patterns of behavior from how you click on your keyboard, eye movements. And as we go into the metaverse, of course, the opportunities are endless. So as long as antitrust sticks to a qualitative approach, where if you invest, then surely it is good, and we don't add a qualitative aspect of what are your incentives, what are your value chains, what is your profit motive, and what is it that you're likely to do with that, I think what we might find ourselves is celebrating the wrong type of innovation. And another aspect of innovation that I certainly worry about, and we heard earlier today some comments about market steeping, and of course we all worry about. I think one of the reasons markets are tipping is because we don't always take full account of the way in which big tech barons distort innovation paths. Of course, we are aware of killer acquisitions. We are aware of certain things. To some extent, we have discussions on how big tech distorts supply of innovation, exclusion. But big tech also distorts the demand for innovation on the ecosystems. Big tech is able to project outside as to availability of funding when it comes to innovation. The market for ideas is highly concentrated and influenced by big tech. So if we think about the future, one of the challenges that we have, I believe, is to make sure that disruption is actually credible. And to do that, we have to find ways of really addressing the paths of innovation and maintaining them. And this can be both through negative action, saying what is illegal, but also through support policies. And I'll end just with a general comment of, so what do we need to do as we look to the future? I think we're definitely doing the right things, but in a way, I often feel that we need to warn ourselves about overly celebrating successes. So with antitrust, of course, widening the scope of antitrust, trying to make it more practical, these are all good things. But as we heard earlier, it's many times just a drop in the ocean, and we just need to remember that. And I think that sometimes when you consider the endless resources that are being invested in every case on the side of the companies, it's almost a draining exercise. And this is why when we have, or when we as a society, a successful case, there is such a celebration. But I often think that it's almost, imagine a soldier celebrating the fact that they were able to stop one person marching towards them and ignore the rest of the army that continue marching. And we just have to be mindful of that. I think we definitely need to continue with the ex-ante regulation. But as we heard, it's a long game. So a lot of it will depend on how you incentivize compliance. There is no way that this can be done just through, let's say, rigid enforcement, because the resources on both sides are so different. There is such a massive asymmetry. So it is about not going for the lower hanging fruits. It is about really encouraging companies to collaborate and being very careful about what it is that we're targeting. And maybe my last comment is about the international dimension. It's really encouraging to me to see that these efforts are found all around the world. But I'm also conscious of the fragility of a lot of those efforts and the fragility of some of the ideas in some jurisdictions. And my hope is that what we'll see is a combined move, and we will not see some sort of a race to the bottom where suddenly this game shifts completely, and it's about who attracts investments. And I think this is something which is a bit worrying, because although we tell ourselves that our regulation can also address other companies, at some point, especially when it comes to structural remedies, it just becomes too politically toxic, and certain things would be very hard to achieve unless we take a move which is relatively global in nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we've come to the end. We have no more time for panel discussion, although I keep thinking each one of these panels was so interesting and good, and the speakers were so amazing. I'd like to do a conference on each one of them. But thank you so much for being here. I would invite you to leave the stage, and then we proceed to the very, very last segment with Olivier Gersan, whom I hope is here.